Well, good afternoon. I'm William Anthony Hay. I'm the interim director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. And I'm very glad you can join us for today's lecture, today's talk by former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott on the challenge from China and Indo-Pacific security. Now, this is the school, SCETL, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership's seventh year organizing a civic discourse project of public lectures for ASU and the Phoenix community and for national audiences. We're very glad to continue our collaboration with Arizona PBS. They've archived all their events on their website and broadcast episodes in the spring of each year. So you can explore the video archive of our speaker events and our webinars also on SCETL's YouTube channel and on our ASU website, including all the lectures and dialogue events from 2017 onward. Let me also thank, besides our Arizona PBS partners, let me also thank the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations for co-sponsoring this event and for joining with us in hosting Mr. Abbott. The PCFR is an important asset to the Arizona community, to the Metro Phoenix area, and bringing discussion of international relations and bringing important figures, diplomats, former officials, and others to our area and to engage with our local community. And they have an upcoming international State of the State program that highlights Arizona's global ties, particularly our global economic ties. So we're very glad to work with the PCFR. And I would particularly thank Sam Richardson and Tina Waddington for their support in putting all of this on. Now, SCETL's mandate as a school of civic thought and leadership encompasses statecraft along with American constitutionalism and the mechanics of government, the ideas behind governance. Competitive statecraft is essential to meeting challenges the United States and other Western countries face. Besides relevant courses SCETL offers and the scholarship we support, the school hosts public events like this one today that bring issues before the ASU and wider community. And now on to our speaker. Mr. Tony Abbott was elected Prime Minister by the Australian people on September 7th, 2013, and served for 2 years. During his tenure, Australia became the second largest military contributor to the US-led campaign against the Islamic State in Iraq. The people smuggling trade from Indonesia to Australia was halted, and the biggest federally supported infrastructure in Australian history commenced. As Prime Minister, he also chaired the G20 meeting of global leaders in Brisbane in November 2014. Now, prior to entering Parliament, Mr. Abbott was a journalist with the Australian newspaper, a senior advisor to opposition leader John Hewson, and director of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. He has degrees in economics and law from Sydney University and in politics and philosophy from Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. In 2020, he was appointed as a Companion of the Order of Australia, and in 2022 awarded the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun. Currently, Mr. Abbott is a director of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization. He serves on the Council of the Australian War Memorial. He's an advisor to the UK Board of Trade and a visiting fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs and the Danube Institute. I'm delighted to welcome Tony Abbott.
Thank you, Will. It's an honour to be here, and it's great to be at a university which obviously engages with the public and which is interested in talking to practitioners in the real world. I have to say to you, Will, that I've been in public life now for pretty close to 40 years, and I think it's only twice since I entered Parliament in 1994 that an Australian university has invited me to speak. And it says something about the different approach of American and Australian universities that a practicing politician, even if now retired, is welcome at a school such as this to address such a gathering. Now, I wish I was here to talk about the China opportunity. I really do, because it would be so much better to be speaking about how the whole world could go forward together, particularly utilising the undoubted genius of the Chinese people and learning from that great civilisational state. But instead, we do need to talk about the China challenge. It is extremely serious and regrettably, it's likely to intensify in the years and decades to come. In fact, there's no doubt that we are now at the beginning of a new Cold War. A Cold War that could be every bit as difficult, as taxing, as costly, as stressful as the last one, because not only is China rapidly becoming a first-rate military, but it is undoubtedly a first-rate economy. And for all the military challenge that the Soviet Union posed over many decades, Russia was never more than a third-rate economy, and Russia and the other Comecon nations were more or less hermetically sealed from the economies of the wider world. I want to make just 3 points at the outset. First, I want to make a very sharp distinction between the Chinese people on the one hand and the current Chinese government on the other. I want to make it absolutely crystal clear that whatever criticisms I have of the Communist Party regime in Beijing, whatever anxieties I have about the direction of China under the CCP, I've got no quarrel and no criticism whatsoever of the Chinese people themselves. I believe very much that Chinese people are like people everywhere. They're interested in their families, in their neighbours, in their communities, in their friends, in their faith. They want to get ahead and they want to get along, like everyone else. The Chinese government, though, is rather different. What we have with the current Beijing regime is, if you like, traditional Chinese exceptionalism compounded and reinforced by Marxism-Leninism. And that's what makes these times so fraught, or it's part of what makes these times so fraught. I probably also should just briefly confess to you that while I am now very much a China hawk, if I might use that phrase, I haven't always been. In fact, as Prime Minister, I concluded a free trade deal between my country and China. It was a very good deal in terms of eliminating tariffs and quotas. It was in fact the only free trade deal at the time, and I think since, that China has done with a G20 economy. And thanks to that trade deal, our exports have continued to boom, notwithstanding some difficulties that I will go into in a moment. Our exports have continued to boom, and we now do something like $250 billion worth of trade with China. Also, in my time as Prime Minister, the relationship was elevated to a so-called comprehensive strategic partnership, and Australia, admittedly, after insisting upon some changes, joined the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a Chinese-led institution, and we joined under my leadership the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank, notwithstanding the slight objections of both the United States and Japan. So I did my best in the different circumstances that applied a decade ago to build a strong and a constructive relationship with China. The third point I want to make is that it's difficult for us, citizens of a democracy, citizens of a country, in the case of America, in the case of Australia, that for 200 years or more has been a liberal civil society, which just has in the marrow of its bones notions of individual freedom, of civil society, of regular elections, of accountable government, and the rule of law. It's difficult for people whose experience has been so happy to grasp the different mindset in different places. As a democratic politician that has to be elected, that is accountable to a democratically elected parliament, I'm thinking about how do I improve schools? How do I improve hospitals? How do I build better roads? How do I raise the standard of living of my people? The ruler of China, provided he's got the support of his Politburo and provided there's no revolutionary upheaval, doesn't really have to worry about any of these things, or at least to nothing like the same extent. So rulers such as Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, the erstwhile rulers of Gaza, they can focus on fundamental ideological objectives. They can focus on national glory, if you like, or ideological worldviews, if you like, in a way that a normal democratic leader can't. And there's absolutely no doubt that what obsesses Xi Jinping, and presumably an obsession shared by his current senior colleagues, is to end what the Chinese leadership calls the century of humiliation, beginning in the 1840s with the Anglo-Chinese Wars, the ceding of Hong Kong to Britain. They think that this was the darkest time in Chinese history, and it started to improve, they think, in 1949 when the communist government took over in Beijing. And their determination now is to eliminate every residue of that period, crushing the freedom of Hong Kong, notwithstanding the Anglo-Chinese Treaty, which guaranteed one country, two systems for a half century, was part of that. The next step is taking Taiwan by force, if necessary, and the final achievement will be the establishment of China as the number one global power, the global hegemon, if you like, by mid-century. How do we know this? We know this because the Chinese leadership tells us again and again and again and again that this is their intention. And again, this is part of the problem with the democratic mindset. We tend to think that people in authority will say one thing to get elected and then not necessarily do it once they get there. People whose rule ultimately depends on fear can't afford to make promises or threats, if you like, that they don't carry out. And we have to take the Chinese leadership seriously when it says it is absolutely necessary for Taiwan, as they see it, to be reunited with the motherland. We have to take them seriously, particularly when all their actions, their belligerence towards their neighbours, even towards their giant southern neighbour India, their increasing aggression towards Taiwan is absolutely consistent with everything that we say. So the challenge is how adequately to respond to this contemporary communist superpower, how adequately to win this new and potentially more difficult and dangerous Cold War. Obviously, there is a military response. Obviously, it's important for countries such as the United States to rebuild the militaries that have been steadily run down with the withdrawal of the peace dividend over the last 3 decades. But that's easier said than done. The US military believes that it needs a 350-ship navy. There's no likelihood of that being achieved anytime soon. In fact, in plain sight, over the last decade or so, the Chinese Navy has become numerically far superior to the US Navy. We don't just have the People's Liberation Navy, we've also got the Coast Guard, which is larger than probably just about any other navy in the world except the US Navy. And then we've got the maritime militia, very large flotillas of boats that might be fishing boats or might be effectively auxiliaries of the Chinese Navy. We do need to ensure that as far as possible, China doesn't think that any attack on Taiwan would pit 1.4 billion Chinese against 25 million Taiwanese. We have to raise doubts in the minds of Beijing's military planners as to whether it might not pit China against the world, or at least China against a strong partnership of democracies. I have to say that I am encouraged by President Biden's statement on no fewer than 4 occasions that America would militarily assist Taiwan. And even though he has had his statements somewhat walked back by State Department officials, the fact that on 4 separate occasions he's made them, I think is encouraging. I also think it's encouraging that senior figures in the Japanese leadership, including my late great friend Shinzo Abe and another former Prime Minister Taro Aso, have said that the Japanese would regard any attack on Taiwan as effectively an attack on Japan itself. I think these are encouraging developments. I don't suppose that we have quite moved from a doctrine of strategic ambiguity to a position of strategic clarity, but at least President Biden has effectively redefined strategic ambiguity to make it a stronger commitment than it previously was. But I don't think anyone should underestimate the difficulty of defending Taiwan at this time. In earlier crises, America has strongly asserted the inviolability of Taiwan by the simple expedient of sailing an aircraft carrier battle group through the Straits of Taiwan. No military planner that I talk to thinks that a US carrier battle group would be anything other than incredibly vulnerable were it to do something like that today in a time of hostility. Nevertheless, notwithstanding the fact that it would be a much less unequal struggle today than at any time in the past, it is important that the democracies led by the United States boost their military. There's always an important economic dimension to any superpower contest, any great power rivalry, because in the end, a country's military strength is absolutely founded on its economic strength. And one of the difficulties for us today is the high level of economic interdependence between China and the democracies. As I said, some 30 to 35% of Australia's exports go to China. And while we discovered when the Chinese capriciously boycotted some $20 billion a year of our coal, barley, beef, wine and lobster exports, while we discovered that for most of them there are alternative markets, so that boycott didn't do the damage that might otherwise have been the case. What is much more serious is China's presence in so many of our critical supply chains. We know that as far as the Chinese are concerned, trade is strategy by other means. Everything is political. There is no such thing as a free market. There is no such thing as an independent business. And the Chinese would undoubtedly turn this on and off like a tap if it was necessary to suit their strategic purposes. Decoupling, at least in vital supply chains from China, will be a lengthy and a costly exercise. I believe it is a necessary exercise, particularly for a country like the United States, if it is to remain what it always has been, the great arsenal of democracy. But it's not just our economic dependency, interdependency that's an issue. There's also, if I may say so, the widespread economic self-harm that we are inflicting upon ourselves. Now, I believe that I'm as much of a conservationist as anyone. I am as committed as anyone to the flourishing of the only planet that we've got. But I do question the wisdom of tackling climate change in ways which are driving up the cost of power, in ways which are sending industries offshore, and in ways which are generally making us economically less efficient. A country which thinks that the greatest economic, political and moral challenge of our times is climate change is at the very least going to be extremely distracted if it comes to fighting a war or even running a Cold War. Which brings me to the third issue where a different and better response is needed. One of the reasons why the democracies ultimately triumphed in the first Cold War was because, at least in comparison with our Soviet rival, we were confident that right was on our side. We were confident that our society was better, morally better, not just richer, but morally better than our strategic competitor. Is that true today? Is that true today? Is an America angst-ridden about slavery? Is a Britain angst-ridden about the legacy of empire? Is an Australia angst-ridden over whether the arrival of Governor Phillip in 1788 was a foundational moment or a day of shame? Are countries angst-ridden about themselves in any position to resist a great strategic competitor? Now, there are some very positive developments. The Quad, the quadrilateral strategic dialogue involving India, Australia, Japan and the United States, is a development with vast potential and great significance. I always used to describe India as Prime Minister as the world's emerging democratic superpower. And since then, India has only got stronger. India is now the world's fastest growing major economy. Indian economic growth is hitting about 7% a year, and I think that is sustainable for quite a long period of time. I think India's economic development is now comparable to where China was a couple of decades back. The Quad is a very important development, but it's only going to work if it is, at least as between India and the United States, a genuine partnership of equals rather than an American-led partnership. The Quad is the first time that independent India has moved away from strategic detachment, and it's very important to encourage further movement, but the only way that will work is if America appreciates Indian pride and self-respect and potential. Then, of course, there's AUKUS, the renewed military and strategic partnership between the great Anglosphere countries that was driven by my distinguished successor, Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister of Australia. AUKUS is not just about giving Australia nuclear-powered submarines, initially Virginia-class submarines from the United States, but ultimately a new generation British nuclear submarine that will be built in Australia as well as in the United Kingdom. It's not just about getting nuclear-powered submarines, important though that is for the strategic balance in East Asia. It's also about a whole new level of defence and security cooperation where the three AUKUS countries are essentially treated as one for military procurement and strategic cooperation purposes. An extremely important development, and for someone such as myself who has long regarded the Anglosphere countries as essentially family, has long regarded the Anglosphere countries as only foreign in a juridical as opposed to a real sense. It's a wonderful, wonderful development. But it will take years to come to fruition, and the challenge is not necessarily in a decade's time. It's next week, next month, next year, this decade. This is a period of great danger. I can remember a few years ago, I was in a meeting with someone who lived in my then constituency. This individual was regarded by our security agencies as being far too close to Beijing, but sometimes you've got to talk to people, even those who might not be in every respect your friend. And this individual, a Chinese billionaire then living in Australia, reputedly very close to the CCP, said to me in the middle of this meeting, you know, at some time in the next few years, in order to buttress the position domestically, there will be an attack on Taiwan. And we know that dictators in difficulty often tend to foreign adventurism, to play the patriot card. I wondered, why am I being told this? Is it to gauge my reaction? Is it a message that I am meant to pass on, which I hasten to add I duly did? But if people close to the regime talk like that, this is something that we have to take exceedingly seriously. But again, and I end on this note, in the end, we have to believe that freedom is worth striving for. We have to believe that our societies are worthy. We have to believe, in the case of the United States, to use Reagan's resonant phrases, that it remains a shining city on a hill, that it remains the last best hope of mankind. I believe that the United States has done an extraordinary job over the last 7 decades. After the Second World War, the torch of global leadership was peacefully passed from the United Kingdom to the United States. For 7 decades now, American sentinels have stood guard around the world. And the fact that the modern world is more safe, more rich, more free, more fair for more people than at any time in human history is due to the long Pax Americana. I can understand why America is a weary titan. I can understand why people in Middle America particularly question what has been in it for them, particularly when they see working class people under pressure, particularly when they see great industries like the steel industry and the auto industry increasingly going offshore. I just want the people of America to know that at least this foreigner is grateful. As far as I'm concerned, the world should be grateful. America remains the indispensable nation, and I just hope that the rest of you will keep the faith.
Hello. Yes, I had a question. So you talked about issues with economic decoupling and military. What diplomatic options might we still have to sort of prevent a bigger disaster?
Well, I think that Blinken had quite a good, neat encapsulation of the approach that the United States should adopt to China under its current leadership. And if I can remember it correctly, it was something like this. We should cooperate where we can, we should compete where we should, and we should confront where we must. Cooperate where we can, compete where we should, confront where we must. I think that's a pretty good summation, and whatever other thoughts one might have about different policies of the current administration, I think that it's handled China pretty well.
Hello. I wonder if you can share some insight. About 20 years ago, a Chinese plane crashed into an American P-3 Orion reconnaissance plane. And a few months ago, something similar happened when a Chinese plane dropped chaff in front of an Australian P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance plane. Now, are these decisions made by the top level of the People's Republic of China? Are they made by the top levels of the People's Liberation Army? Or is this just something that the rogue pilot is doing?
Look, that's a very, very good question. And I think we have to say that nothing of such deliberation would happen without at least the broad blessing of the people at the top. Let me give you a different example, which I think might nevertheless be instructive. Back on the 17th of July 2014, a Russian missile battery moved out of Russia into the eastern Ukraine and shot at what I imagine they thought was a Ukrainian military transport, but which turned out to be flight MH17, which was brought down with the death of 298 people, including 38 Australian citizens. So for me, this was a very personal, it was an extraordinary moment. And sometime later, I was involved in what was described as my shirt front conversation with Vladimir Putin. And a shirt front is a very rough tackle. It's Australian rules terminology for a very rough tackle. And this is how I went about it. I said, look, Vladimir, I do not say that you personally ordered that missile to be fired and that you are personally and directly responsible for the downing of that plane. But Russian missile batteries don't wander out of Russia into another country by accident. You must have given broad authorisation for that missile battery to operate in the aid of the Russian-backed rebels. Therefore, at the very least, you owe the families of the dead an apology and compensation. As it happened, Putin gave me a long rant through an interpreter about how the Ukrainians were all fascists. It was a provocateur, a Ukrainian provocateur who'd brought down the plane. And anyway, Ukraine belonged to Russia. So very early on, I got what I thought was a pretty good insight into this guy's messianic drive to recreate the Russia of Peter the Great. But we're talking now about much less serious infringements, obviously. We're not talking about atrocities or crimes. We're talking now about aggressive action by the Chinese military against American and Australian military. At the very least, it indicates an assertive belligerence. Did Xi Jinping personally order a Chinese plane to drop chaff in the path of an Australian plane? I doubt it very much. But did Xi Jinping indicate to his military that they should be pretty robust in any interactions in disputed territory? I'd be certain that would be the case.
If I may, that very good question and your response raises an important point about an echo of the Cold War. How do you avoid escalation in a difficult time while still maintaining deterrence?
Well, not only are we, in a sense, seeing echoes of the 1950s, they're actually combined with echoes of the 1930s. We not only have a new Cold War between the United States and China, between the democratic West and the new communist superpower, we also have, if you like, a series of dictatorships, aggressive dictatorships. I mean, there's the No Limits partnership between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And you've still got apocalyptic Islamism, as we have been reminded with the Hamas October the 7th atrocity against Israel. So these are very fraught times. They are absolutely fraught times. And one thing I do know is that you don't avoid catastrophe with weakness. I mean, weakness is provocative. Bullies only respect strength. Now, no one should ever go looking for a fight. But if people don't think you're prepared to fight, well, then they will take and take and take and take, and eventually there will be a fight in a much more disadvantageous position than before, or there will be a surrender. And I don't think that should ever be our response.
What do you think are the primary challenges to the economic engines of Western countries that are going to be obviously needed in order to fund the military buildup that will be necessary? And how would you think about best to address them? I know it's a big question.
Well, it's a very important topic, obviously. Look, we need to do everything we reasonably can to improve the dynamism of our economies. And look, I have great faith in the creativity of the United States. I mean, America Unleashed is an amazingly creative country. The same is true of Britain and Australia to a lesser extent, but obviously America has enormous capacity if roused, if mobilised. And I think that free countries always have an inherent strength as against command economies and dictatorships where people are not free to be fully creative. But there are things that we are doing at the moment which are hindering us. I think our societies are overtaxed and overregulated generally. I think that we have pursued policies with the best will in the world, which have turned out to have put us in a disadvantage. I'm all in favour of free trade, but free trade with countries that don't practice free trade, which indeed exploit free trade to their advantage without practicing it themselves, free trade with them ultimately becomes counterproductive. And much freer trade with China over the last couple of decades has been advantageous to the extent that it's given us cheaper flat-screen TVs, but it's also devastated vast sections of the manufacturing base of countries like America, Britain and Australia. And given the strategic realities, I think it's important that these be rebuilt as quickly as possible by not having free trade with China, by not sharing significant secrets with China, by not giving them access to our manufacturing processes and so on. So I think that's important. As I said in my remarks, I think a lot of our emissions reduction policies are very well intentioned because we have to keep the planet safe, but I do think a lot of it verges on economic self-harm. And I do think that focusing on getting rid of all internal combustion engines and stopping eating meat, changing the way we farm, etc., I think that is going to weaken us. And as I often say, I don't think the Ukrainians are worrying too much about climate change right now. I don't think the Israelis are obsessing about emissions right now. Interestingly, the Taiwanese are. They've, as I understand it, closed down their one nuclear power plant. And at the same time are doing their best to go to renewables. So I suppose they're an example of people who are trying to combine strong action on climate with a stronger strategic defence posture. So anyway, I think it's very important that we take a hard-headed approach to these subjects. As I said, I am all in favour of freer trade, which undeniably makes everyone richer in the long run. But in the short run, it can make some countries much richer and other countries only a little bit richer. And freer trade between like-minded countries with comparable standards of living is a much more obvious immediate benefit than other forms of freer trade.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking. So in terms of a war between the CCP and the United States, there's been conversation about how the US should be increasing its allies in the Indo-Pacific region and strengthening these countries so they may be able to keep China in check in the home front. And I'm curious how realistic you think this is, and should this be the focus of the US in terms of this Cold War happening?
Well, I think the point to make is that the object of everything we do should be to avoid hostilities. That is the object of everything we do, because war between the superpowers would be cataclysmic. It really would be cataclysmic. The objective is to avoid war, not to have it. That's the objective. But given everything that the CCP leadership, the Beijing regime says, nice words, resolutions passed by the United Nations, strong speeches in Congress are not going to deter the Beijing regime. The only thing that will deter them is the expectation that the price of war is too high, that war is something that they might lose, because I think they are rational. Unlike the apocalyptic Islamists, I think at least the Chinese leadership is rational. So I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to do what we can to make the Chinese leadership doubt that this could succeed. And obviously, strong alliances are absolutely at the heart of that. And that's why the Quad is such a positive development, because while it's not a military alliance, it is a definite tilt by India towards the West. And while I wouldn't necessarily expect India to be an active participant in the defence of Taiwan, I do think that if the Chinese had to worry about their southern frontier, that would add a further element of doubt to any thinking about adventurism across the Taiwan Strait.
What we Americans and what Europeans call the Far East, for Australia it's the Near North. But for other countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and certainly Japan, it's even closer than that. So how does Chinese policy towards its near abroad affect some of these alliance dynamics?
Well, Chinese policy towards its near abroad is bruising, even brutal. I mean, look at the treatment that the Philippines get, and while the Philippines is probably more frequently the recipient of very assertive belligerence, Indonesia has not entirely escaped it. I think it's the Natuna Islands, is it? Is that the, Andrew, the Natuna Islands, which fall within the 9-dashed line. They're Indonesian controlled, but Chinese maritime militia have certainly been very heavily present there on occasions and have provoked an Indonesian naval response. I think it'd be fair to say that the countries of Southeast Asia don't want to act in a provocative way with China, and they don't want to look like they are, deputy sheriffs of Uncle Sam, but they are nevertheless incredibly anxious to have a strong and robust American presence in the region, because without a strong and robust American presence in the region, either they would have to arm themselves to the teeth in order to be relatively resistant to bullying, or they would have to effectively make the best accommodation they could with Beijing. Something that most Americans aren't aware is that a couple of years back, the Chinese embassy in Canberra, infuriated by various policies of the Australian government, issued us with a list of 14 demands or 14 grievances, and basically it was that we would accept all Chinese students, accept all Chinese investment, cease all criticism of the Chinese government, have no opinion about any issue where the Chinese government had an opinion, and end the American alliance. Now, no sovereign, self-respecting nation could do that, but that's the essential, that's what China essentially expects of all its neighbours, and indeed ultimately of everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. It's, while it's refreshing to see India end its strategic detachment by joining the Quad, as you've pointed out, India is also a kind of messy, argumentative, somewhat insular democracy.
A bit like the United States.
But unlike the United States, with a long tradition of tailoring its foreign policy very narrowly around its own interests. So my question is, to what extent is India's presence in the Quad as much potentially a drag on the Quad's ability to act decisively and energetically as it is a boon or a blessing?
Well, I mean, the Quad is not like NATO. There's no Article 5. and there's no institutional establishment or anything like that. The Quad is a bit like the Five Eyes, only an incipient as opposed to a well-established partnership. The Five Eyes, the substance of the Five Eyes is no written document, no formal treaty. It's just the fact that there is almost complete interoperability and personnel exchange between the respective Five Eyes countries. Now, with the Quad, initially it was just routine meetings of senior officials. Then it became more regular meetings of foreign ministers and defence ministers, and it's more recently become regular summits of leaders. Now, once this has become a well-established tradition, inevitably there's going to be an increasing like-mindedness between the countries, and that doesn't mean that India's interests will be identical to Japan's, or that Australia's interests will be identical with India's, but it does mean that our manner of thinking about things will become much more similar. And the fact, Tunku, that India, very much like the United States and as part of the at times dubious inheritance from Mother England, has democracy, the rule of law, a civil service which is at least aspiring to efficiency and incorruptibility, and to a great extent the English language, means that India's mental universe is naturally quite like ours anyway, and I think a lot of India's strategic insularity was due to the developmental issues, the inevitable developmental issues that independent India had to grapple with, the more urgent challenge of Pakistan in the early years, and the unfortunate tendency of the United States through the Cold War to see India as a kind of Soviet satellite and to side with Pakistan. A lot of Indians of a certain age are still quite resentful of that. I can remember going to a conference in Delhi a couple of years back and being told by the deputy director of the Indian think tank where I was, who was a former Indian naval officer, that his first contact with Australians was being shadowed by P-3 Orions from the Royal Australian Air Force that were taking the Indians as kind of Soviet surrogates. So there is a bit of history, old history and new history, or newer history, that needs to be lived down. But as I said, if you spend a lot of time in other people's company, and that's the whole object of the Quad, that our people and their people will be spending a lot of time in each other's company, you do develop a kind of a inevitable affinity which over time will have very significant strategic consequences, even if it never goes beyond the current informal partnership arrangements.
This is a little bit off topic, but I think it's an important question. The United States is politically very polarized right now. Mm-hmm. Serious people are talking about concerns about democracy and the Constitution holding. How would other Western countries, Australia, Europe, et cetera, how do they see this as a potential threat for the future of our country and us being the indispensable nation that we are?
Well, one of the things that I've tried to do, unlike some of my ex-prime ministerial colleagues, is never engage in gratuitous public criticism of the leader of the free world, or indeed ex-leaders of the free world, because I just think it's extremely unhelpful. That said, you only have to pick up a newspaper and it's obvious that America's mood is not optimal at the moment. I mean, you know, the bright new dawn, it's morning in America. We're a long way from that. But look, things will change. They always do. And hopefully, at some point in time, the American polity will be less centrifugal and become more centripetal. We can but hope. We can but hope. From where I sit, the President of America is really the President of the world, or at least the President of the free world, and I just wish I got to vote in the election.
First of all, thank you for being here. I think it's a tremendous honor that people like myself, students, get to learn from people such as yourselves. Second of all, for my question, I don't mean to sound too idealistic, but you know, America has the Pax Americana that you spoke about. You know, it might have failed in the Middle East, and you know, with the end of the Cold War, it was brought less by war and more through diplomatic means. So I know you mentioned a couple very harsh ways to contain China, or like defense against China. Would there be any way going forward that you see more cooperation between the West and China for a better future, perhaps more diplomatically?
Well, if it were ever in China's obvious national interest to cooperate with us, they would. For instance, Australia cooperated very well with China in a relatively small way. That was the search for MH370, the Malaysian airline that disappeared into the wastes of the southern Indian Ocean. That happened in my time as Prime Minister, and we moved heaven and earth to try to find that aircraft, and the Chinese were actually very grateful for it. I think one of the reasons why we got our free trade deal was Xi Jinping being grateful for the efforts that Australia made at that time. I mean, we dispatched several naval ships. We had half the Air Force scouring the wastes of the southern Indian Ocean for several weeks in an attempt to find it. So look, we can cooperate, but we should never assume that their leadership thinks just like ours. They don't. The Chinese people might inherit a similar mental universe, but the Chinese leadership does not inhabit the same mental universe as ours does. I mean, our leaders stay in power by appealing to the people. Their leaders stay in power effectively by crushing and intimidating the people. And accountability in China is very different to accountability in the United States and the other democracies. And it's only when we grasp that I think we're able to understand the magnitude of the challenge. I mean, I don't want to do the cheap thing and equate dictators of one generation with dictators of another generation as if they're the same. But you know, Churchill did not think like Hitler, but only a leader that understood Hitler, as Churchill did, was able to combat him. The leaders that didn't really understand were the ones that engaged in the acts of appeasement, which ultimately helped to bring on the catastrophe of the Second World War.
One issue with seeking improved relations and path to ties, and this brings up a parallel from the past, the Cold War. During the Cold War, there are various points where Europeans feared the United States would make a deal with the Soviet Union over their heads, while many in the United States and some Europeans feared that perhaps Germany would look to Ostpolitik, East politics, and cut a deal with Russia. So are there any parallels you would see with the West and Australia and China these days?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is China has almost no soft power. Other than perhaps with the Chinese diaspora, China has almost no soft power. China has almost no real friends. I mean, even Putin and Xi's relationship is entirely transactional, and it's based not on any real affinity, just on shared antipathy. That's really what it is. So look, might South Korea do a deal with China? Might Japan do a deal with China? Might India do a deal with China? I don't see it, because I think all of those countries have a very clear-eyed assessment of the real nature of the Chinese party state and the real nature of the Beijing regime. And while they are quite properly apprehensive and don't want to do anything that might make a bad situation worse, I don't think for a moment they imagine that Beijing's embrace would be anything other than suffocating.
Thank you for being here today. After watching America and Europe become somewhat fatigued with Ukraine and so much of our societies wanting a ceasefire in Gaza, do you think Western societies have become uncomfortable with the idea of total military victory? And does this apply to Taiwan, or will Taiwan be an exception?
Well, quite rightly, we want to avoid war. I mean, you know, war is about the most horrible thing that can happen. I mean, it's as destructive as the most cataclysmic natural disaster, only it's in a sense self-inflicted. So it's gruesome beyond belief, and yet the alternative to war is sometimes surrender. And I don't believe that any self-respecting country, or indeed any self-respecting individual, can entirely surrender himself, herself, itself on things that are absolutely vital to being a self-respecting person. Now, it's true that many of us, if we see a traffic accident or we see a fight in the street, would prefer to look the other way and walk by. The trouble, if you do that too often, is that eventually the place becomes just bedlam, and you can't avoid it. But by then, the situation is so much worse than it was at the beginning. So look, I can absolutely understand people saying there must be an alternative, for instance, to Israel going building by building, tunnel by tunnel, room by room through Gaza, with the resultant destruction and the resultant casualties. But no one has come up with it. No one has come up with it. I mean, if these people who keep saying, oh, look, Israel is doing the wrong thing, were able to come up with an alternative strategy that would equally get rid of Hamas, well, then it'd be easier to take them seriously. At the moment, rather than being highly moral, I think these people are just being highly escapist. Because if you're an Israeli, you cannot tolerate the existence next door of an organisation, an empowered organisation that wants you dead. You just cannot tolerate it. And it's a tragedy that the campaign against Hamas has such a high toll. Of course it's a tragedy. But if Hamas surrendered the hostages, and if Hamas genuinely agreed to allow Israel to exist behind secure borders, surrendered its apocalyptic death to the infidel mindset, I think no one would be quicker to say, great, let bygones be bygones than the Israelis. But they'll never do it. They'll never do it, because for them, crushing and destroying this alien entity, this Jewish state, It's not just, if you like, an ambition. It's a mission from God as they see it, and that's the difficulty, and that's the mindset that people like us have trouble grasping.
We have time for one final question.
Hi, Prime Minister Abbott. Thank you for being here. So my question is, what do you make of the long-term challenges of China at this point in time? Being a one-party state, they have huge challenges with corruption, and one-party states tend not to last long. Economic bubbles tend to have more problems. Demographic issues with the one-child policy, immigration issues. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But,
Look, you're right, and look, you know, dictators have a kind of an outward bluster, but often an inward insecurity. And I think that's certainly true of Putin. It's probably less true of the Chinese regime because it's a party dictatorship as opposed to a personal dictatorship, and I guess that provides a bit more institutional ballast than would otherwise be the case. But I have no doubt that the Chinese regime is very attentive to internal threats. I mean, notwithstanding the gargantuan increase in the Chinese military budget, apparently the internal security budget has increased even more. So obviously that does worry them. And look, my instinct is that at some point in time, that monolith will start to crumble, just as the old Soviet Union started to crumble. But part of the reason why it crumbled was because of the economic and strategic competition from the West. And I guess when under Reagan, America decided to outcompete the Soviets in every sphere, that ratcheted up the pressure on them, and at some point in time something similar might happen in China. So look, at some time, if we don't, as it were, surrender in the meantime, something will happen. But whether it's a year, a decade, a century, we just don't know.
Well, thank you very much. I should add one last point, since you had mentioned the AUKUS deal. Arizona State University is a partner with the University of New South Wales and King's College London in the Security and Defence Plus initiative to support, as providing intellectual ballast for that agreement. So we're very glad here in the desert, here in Arizona, to be a part of that. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you again, Tony. Thank you again,